Good afternoon. Today I want to look at the second part of my introduction to the ideas of Bruno Latour. The reading I sent you was double. The main reading is entitled Drawing Things Together, a very witty title, literally pulling things together and drawing as part of this process. And the consolation for reading that is the Compositionist Manifesto, which makes a deliberate pun, of course, on the Communist Manifesto, and says, given the way we Latourians think, what kind of future should we be aiming for? And does the notion of a future make much sense? Should we not be looking at the idea of the prospect? But I leave the Compositionist Manifesto to you. It is a very readable piece, and it should give you some comfort after the ideas we discussed today. Now, drawing things together lays out in a very comprehensive way, and therefore quite dense and full of citations to other people, lays out a central idea that Wikipedia will attach to Bruno Latour on your behalf, and that is the idea of an actor network. He makes great play on the word ant. He said, we are actor network theorists, we are ants. We do modest things on the ground and make small connections and whatever, and that's how we work with the ants' humility and industriousness. But what you have laid out at quite an early stage in his work in that reading is a network of actors. And from last week or last session, you should recognize that what he calls an actor, or what he thinks of as an agency, is anything that has an effect on anything else. So it is not specifically confined to human agents, as we have come to think of agency as almost exclusively human. And then when it comes to nature and things, we tend to speak of causality. For Latour, as we saw last time, it is agency all the way. We saw nature as a powerful agency shaping the social as a powerful agency in shaping it right back, and so on. What he outlays here, however, is a particular network or chain of agents, or things conscripted into the role of agents, that accounts for modernity, science and technology, the modern form of government, colonialism, the modern form of objectivity, the modern conception of nature, the modern notion of bureaucracy. In fact, everything. So we have one very ambitious little ant trail, or bringing together and managing of agencies that for Latour essentially characterizes all post-17th century, for him, modern institutions, ways of thoughts, and also the powers of modern society and the capacities that it has and exercises. So you should be wondering what this golden bullet is. Is this some huge change in political power or reinstitutionalization of power? As Habermas would suggest, his view of modernity and modernism as a reinstitutionalization of knowledge, of experience and the aesthetic, and of the state and rights. Is it a huge kind of upheaval, a stirring up of the subsoil, so that people who have been coping in one way suddenly have different tools to cope with? As Taylor would suggest, he sees human life as a coping predicament that becomes furnished with different instruments or conceptions or devices for coping? So is it a big thing like that? Is it a kind of awakening, such as we find in Richard Rorty, where after the big awakening of the 18th century to the fact that there is no divine power above us who has the right to tell us what we are and what we should do and what we should hope for, comes a second awakening to the fact that nature is not some huge model or prescriptive thing in front of us that can tell us how we should think, what the content or the form of our thinking should be, what the procedures of our thinking should be, that we should be a mirror of nature. We no longer submit to a moral power outside of ourselves, and we no longer submit to an objective world outside of ourselves. Is that kind of Rortian double awakening? Is that the kind of threshold that Latour is talking about to sort of self-characterize the modern? Well, no, it's a lot less ambitious. It's a very modest entrail. And he calls it, and those of you who read Latour and who watch him talk on YouTube will know that he is famously laid back and very witty. He's one of the most humorous philosophers ever. Not quite as laid back as Richard Rorty, who was extraordinarily laid back and I think created as much annoyance for his failure to be baited and rise to the occasion as for his ideas. But Latour is a tremendous wit and therefore chooses deliberately understated ways of putting real atom bomb ideas into circulation. And so he says what he's talking about here is paperwork. He says what makes us modern, what gives us our powers, what seems to separate us from our past in other societies is the amount and the role of paperwork that we do. With this promising start, he gives a set of characteristics that any good paperwork should possess. Now, good paperwork is paperwork that makes you a world-dominating power, that gives you a control over nature and the ability to conceive of nature globally and utilize it globally and impose laws on it globally, that gives you the ability to impose your form of governance on other peoples anywhere on the globe. So this is a serious paperwork. So given these expectations of paperwork, what must paperwork be? Well, he introduces this paperwork with a pun on mobile and immobile, and in French, furnishing and furnished apartments and unfurnished, and how we came to furnish our universe and how we could unfurnish it. But we'll ignore this pun because in English it comes to mobile, immobiles. Once you've got mobile, immobiles, you can rule the world. So obviously paperwork boils down to these mysterious properties, seemingly contradictory properties of mobile, immobiles. And how does he introduce this? He says that the explorers in the wake of Captain Cook's great knowledge-gathering expeditions, there were several other explorations, and one explorer in the service of Louis XVI was sent out to decide whether a particular island somewhere was an island or a peninsula. That was the question. Now, why is this important? Obviously, it makes a difference to whether you want to annex this island, how you want to invade this island, whether with this island you just grab the tail of the tiger and it's attached to a whole country that's going to come down. So obviously there were issues in Versailles, in the center of government at the time, around the status of this island because they wanted to take it. Now, he is sent to specifically decide whether this thing is an island or peninsula, and he has 1 day's stay there. And he finds a member of the Chinese community there, and he says to this person, "Is this an island?" And the Chinese person says yes, has an excellent understanding of the geography, and draws the outline of the island in the sand. As the waves are coming up, a younger Chinese person takes the pencil and paper from the explorer and recopies it so that he can have it. So essentially he's brought nothing. It's not as if he has brought Western writing, Western notation, Western concept of geography, and he's coming into some unformed local knowledge. The way Latour sets up this example is that he comes into a highly informed local knowledge. Everybody in the island knows the geography, etc., and can answer the question in 2 seconds and even give the guy a map to take home. But the difference between the people who are on that island, and as he says, fated to die there, and our explorer who is fated to die back in France and has 1 day on the island, is that the people on the island are not using this knowledge or this piece of notation with a specific question in mind. Whereas our explorer was sent there to settle a dispute. So I now have what I need to go back and settle the dispute. Now, what do I need to settle this dispute? I need a mobile immobile. In other words, I need to be able to capture something important about a faraway place, which no one in France can see, smell, hear, touch. So I capture in a diagram the important answer to the question. This thing is an island. That is the mobile part, because I've taken the island characteristic or property and I'm able to take this attribute with me to answer the debate back home. But the mobile part is that I acquire it there and I take it here and use it here. But the immobile part is that it can't change en route. I obviously can't take the island back with me. I must capture the island, but I must capture it in a reliable way, such that when it gets back here, people will say, yes, this is indeed how things are. I can't capture it in an apple pie or as a holy face on a piece of toast. I have to, in fact, ensure that it is immutable in transit. Once it is immutable in transit, I can then use it as part of a broader discussion and part of a broader documentation, which is the third requirement for Latour, which he says is a flat space, whether it's a wall or a table or a big piece of paper. I can introduce it into that space. In this case, a space that already has Mercator projection systems of longitude and latitude. So I introduce it into a position and I see it as an island. Having gone all that way, having gone out of my way to get the information that this is an island and come back to France, all those detractors who are perhaps against an invasion or against trade or against colonization or whatever to do with this island are now converted to allies. I've brought a piece of reality, let's not call it too hastily a fact, but it's as close to a fact as humans will ever get. I've brought a fact back, but all I brought back is a piece of paper. But it's a piece of paper that has the qualities of mapping something important about the island and at the same time not changing on this journey. It can go up and down this channel between Paris and that island without change. I've created, in a way, a passage. I take the information this way, I recruit allies. How do I recruit allies to whatever I'm trying to do? Sea captains, investors, mercenaries, merchants, geographers, whatever the allies are. Well, they might not start out as allies. They might start out as skeptics or adversaries. But once I've got my mobile, immobile right, for them to challenge my position or continue challenging my position, they would have to go to more trouble than me. They would have to get the money together, mount an expedition, get their own map maker, prove that the thing is indeed a peninsula in some obscure way, come back and in fact undo my mobile immobile with a superior mobile immobile of theirs, which would then replace mine. But since the cost of disagreement has gone up enormously, it's the cost of a whole expedition, which only a king can afford. No one's going to really disagree with me. They will probably cave in. And they will start repeating this information that such and such place is an island, until it's agreed it's an island. Now, if it's an island, how do we approach it? How do we invade it? Who do we send there? What do we want? Or do we ignore it? In other words, in this little story, which is a true story, of course, we see that it's not simply a matter of curiosity about what the world, how the world looks. It's not a matter of a Western mentality that wants to have a geological picture of the world, because in fact it was the Chinese person on the island who provided all the information. All that the explorer did was take this information back and use it to recruit or to align allies to the fact. And dissenters either slunk off into the shadows, muttering, but were out of the picture, or they said, well, we have to really mount another expedition to show that this is not the case. But in fact, the cost of that information now suddenly escalates as the cost of dissent. So because dissent is so costly, we tend to sediment things and create agreement by sedimenting things. And the more we sediment, the more costly disagreement becomes. So if I have a contemporary laboratory experiment and I send somebody in who is a habitual contrarian or a devoted doubter, and they say, well, how do you know that endorphins exist? And this is a favorite example of Latour's. He made the field work in this particular laboratory of a physiologist who wanted to isolate endorphins. You all know what endorphins are. It's that feel-good addictive substance that comes from excessive gymnastics or whatever, jogging. Now, what was involved in the isolation of endorphins? As Latour says, the brain is as complex as the night sky. It's very unclear what's going on in it. So what you have to do is extract some brain juice on the understanding that it's all mixed up. Put it under high pressure so that it's all well mixed. Fire it into a chromatograph, which tells you what it is chemically. And then look at the chromatographic spikes, which will tell you you have different sort of clusters of ingredients. And then repeat this again and again and again until you have less clusters and less clusters and less clusters. And so for this particular juice, which might be number 300 in the well-documented sequence, you have one chromatographic cluster. So it seems like this is a molecule. You then take it and you introduce it to the freshly prepared gut of a guinea pig. Literally a guinea pig, not metaphorically a guinea pig. Some poor guinea pig is pinned down, dispatched, has its gut removed, has a strip of gut tissue, or intestinal tissue, in fact, strung between 2 points, the bottom of which drives a sensor that drives a particular graph, which will tell you whether this gut is reacting. You know that animal tissue reacts for a long time. You know that the sausages in your fridge 3 months later could reconstitute a pig if you had the money, because they're full of individual living cells. But here we have guinea pig gut, right? Now we're talking about the existence of endorphin. On what basis do we claim there is endorphin? So we have this thing, we apply something from this little vial, and we see whether the gut is twitchier or not twitchier. It's as simple as that. And we do it a couple of hundred times. We plot all these things. We throw out the outliers as having arisen from some crazy mistake. And we say, we've discovered endorphin. Somebody else comes along and questions it and says, maybe this needle is blown in the wind. Maybe we should put it in a box So we put it in a double box, we get the same result. They say, well, maybe this is an unusual guinea pig. The 1 in a million that's resistant to any kind of peptide or hormone or whatever, and therefore endorphin doesn't make a difference to this guinea pig nor anything else. Bring another guinea pig, bring another 6. Through the screams of the guinea pig, we get the same result. Well, maybe this was not the right brain peptide. Maybe there are other brain peptides that would do the same thing. So we go and we mash up and we do the spectrum and we refine things from various different parts of the brain, but we get the same result. And then somebody says, but how do you know that chromatography is real? And the answer would be, well, Newton showed that there are spectra, and therefore we're just following Newton. Well, how do you know Newton was right, etc.? By now everybody is extremely impatient and wants this absolute lunatic to be thrown out, and everyone's laughing and sending witty emails about this person who's just doubting everything very obvious. But essentially, what they're saying is that the latest edition is the fact, that everything else has been accumulated and stacked up at great cost. And to doubt this fact, you have to in fact take this stack apart and propose alternatives to the stack. But if the stack adds up, you've got nothing left. So in one version of the story, the intrepid person is not embarrassed, and they carry on. They come up with some completely new theory of light spectra. And when they're getting the Nobel Prize, I said 20 years ago, they laughed at me in the guinea pig lab for questioning the experiment or whatever. But the fact is that in order to question this fact, you would have to reinvent spectral physics, okay, at the cost of other stacks of facts. So what we have here are mobile immobiles. In other words, the property of that brain cell is translated each time through a number of steps, right down to the motion of a guinea pig gut, which is the final translator. And it is preserved across this chain. Because if you ask me, how do you know, like the skeptic, I can say, well, let's repeat that. It happens every time. Or it's backed up by such and such general law, or chemistry tells us X, or whatever. I'm able to manage an entire path from brain soup to guinea pig gut to the Nobel Prize for endorphin. And we all believe in endorphin. Partly because to challenge endorphin would be a tremendously costly exercise. Okay, so this path in the modern laboratory and the path from the explorer to Paris, in fact, does the same thing. It is an enlisting of allies. People who would otherwise question this thing either find it too expensive, or they say, if so much trouble has been gone to establish it, who am I to disagree? So there is an enlisting of allies. But once this mobile immobile is put in place, it gets subject to other translations. The first one, as we mentioned, is that it gets laid into a flat space. It gets put up on a wall. It becomes part of a chart. If it is laid into a flat space, it is then easy for me to conceive of manipulating the scale of that space. So that in the same flat space, we don't get lost in a couple of meters, says Latour, we're not overwhelmed by it. Within that particular space, I can bring another space, and I can bring them onto a similar scale. So, for example, I can look at phenomena which are very far apart in the world, but compress that distance down to the size of a chart this big. I can look at phenomena which come from very different chains and put them into the same space, as with quantum physics informing modern chemistry. The next transformation that can occur is I bring everything within the reach of two hands. Who has the whole night sky within the reach of their two hands? I can do that with the right kind of stellar map. Who has all the ocean currents on the table in a model? Who has an entire oil refinery on the table within a model? Who has all of the particle distributions on a subatomic level on the table, so that I can basically look at this thing, touch it with my two hands, look at it in front of my eyes. I can look at anything and everything on the same scale. So the idea of a model, or the idea of a representation that in fact enters into my comfortable, obvious sensory realm, is the next step. Because everything I've brought in here is homogeneous, I can then bring it to a similar scale, refine a few things, and I can start to shuffle and remix what I have. As happens, for instance, when in the discipline of chemistry, people stopped talking about formulae for arriving at a particular substance, or stopped talking about their alchemical processes and their alembics and their distillations and whatever, and started to create a pictorial set of cards that could be reshuffled. And the job of creating the periodic table was very much a job of motivating the reshuffle. It wasn't a matter of going into chemical labs and saying, I think there are so many alkali metals, let's go and find them. It's a matter of taking everything that was known about alkali metals for the past 200, 300 years in chemistry out of its formula and its laboratory and procedural language, and putting it on a card such that what was on the card, atomic weight and so on, was uniform with what was on the other cards. Therefore, I could start to shuffle these cards into families, and on the basis of shuffling them to families, come to powerful predictions that would allow me to go out and look for things which I know must exist according to the table. And therefore, such as the debate over chlorine in the 19th century, which went on for decades, whether chlorine existed because no one could purify it. So was it really something else, or was this place called chlorine a vacant place? If this was a vacant place and no one could find it, either they couldn't find it because their methods were clumsy, and our grandchildren would find it with ease, so we keep chlorine, or we move chlorine, but that has real repercussions for the table. So again, the cost of questioning, the cost of not allying yourself to this process. But of course, we know we found pure chlorine, and we then went out to create situations completely unnatural in the universe, smashing more atoms in the past couple of decades than the universe has smashed in its entire history, in order to create heavy, very heavy elements which we know exist theoretically, thanks to the table and thanks to nothing else. So the periodic table is an extraordinary example of reducing something to a notation or to shuffling papers in such a way that the uniformity of scale, the uniformity of characteristics, allows just this operation of matching to give us the knowledge and give us this fantastic thing, which of course the periodic table. Those of you who haven't studied the history of the periodic table, get the t-shirt, there are a lot of t-shirts. Buy the doll, see the movie, and look into it, because it is an extraordinary achievement, not of chemistry or of laboratory science, it's an extraordinary achievement of paper. It's one of the great powers of paper. Alan Turing, the conceiver of the Turing machine, the founder of modern computation, originally imagined this machine as working on an infinitely long strip of paper. And when skeptics said to him, well, how can this thing be a universal emulating machine? It's a machine that can emulate anything a mind can do in the act of calculation. He said, you've underestimated the power of paper. In a strange sense, what Latour argues in this piece is a vindication of Turing, because there is really no science without the right manipulations of paper, which is not to say it's made up. What if it is made up of something? Where do the various things come from? They come from expeditions, they come from all over the world. But the minute they are here, they are brought here. We'll we'll say what here is in a moment, they are brought here in an immutable form. Whether it is a perspective drawing, whether it is a diagram or a map, whether it is a set of numbers or readings or coordinates. Nevertheless, they are brought here, and once they are here, we bring them into an unmysterious two-dimensional world. We then bring them into an optimum relation to ourselves, our eyes, our hands, our manipulations. We then harmonize them with one another, as with the periodic table, and we start to shuffle these things to find new possible configurations within them. We can then take some further steps. Having shuffled them, we can integrate them with texts, such that the laboratory or the space where we are doing all of this contains all the relevant visual experiences. And therefore, the words that we use to communicate, are chosen and selected and refined because they align or they perfectly capture these transformed experiences of mobile immobiles that we have collected at such great expense. And so the previous literature can all be harmonized with what we are doing here and enlisted in support of what we're doing. So we're saying the past 300 years of what chemistry has thought or astronomy has thought is now cited in my footnotes. And it's available for you to go and verify. So it becomes part of my chain of translations for this idea in retrospect. I can even enlist the past of my science, clean it up, or enlist the bits that I want. So each science has a recurrential history. It rewrites its own history with every moment. It reselects its history. And on the other hand, I can say I have a draft, I have a work in progress. It's a draft of what? It's a draft of these cumulative results. This intersection of words and the visual. And of course, once I've introduced words into this, and think about in your own discipline, the treatises of the Renaissance, where Vitruvius is basically the subject matter who's being cribbed all the time. That fancy machine they have at UJ and elsewhere to pick up plagiarism would be going right off the scale for all the great Renaissance architectural theorists, because they are immense plagiarizers of Vitruvius. But they do add one unique spin, and that is they're saying Vitruvius's words can never be true without an image. And the diagrams are what is so important in there. And of course, these diagrams are not merely the diagrams of monks high on cappuccino or other distillations. They are coming from the printing press. The printing press provides the ability to cheaply and uniformly and with no change disseminate the same image, the same words. Whereas even if I have a copy of Plato's Republic, and by the way, the works of Plato are a good example because it's assumed that by some philologists that what we have of Plato's original writings is maybe 0.1% of what makes up Plato's text. What we have in between are copied manuscripts up until the age of printing, printed editions. And the copied manuscripts have certain characteristic modes of error. So by understanding those modes of error and rectifying them, we're able to trace one of these we're able to turn this noisy, if you like, error-ridden channel of Christian monks, inventors of whiskey, otherwise distracted people who are copying Plato and making some of the most incredible marginalia in the process. We're able to take this noisy channel and turn it into an immobile, something which does not change Plato because we know the ways it can change. So we reverse the changes, and we have today what we think is really a definitive account of Plato on the basis of enlisting the channel. Okay, sounds far out, but it's exactly what happens in any science, in any expedition, in any laboratory. This is all laboratories are about. So once you can integrate words, and once you have the printing press that allows you to send reliable copies cheaply and easily all over the place, that too creates a consensus. Because it's not like we found one monk, sobered him up, and made a corrected copy. Because 5 or 6 copies down the line, we will have, the errors creeping in again. But with the printing press, it's all a copy of one corrected original. Now, the impact of the printing press, says Latour, everybody would love to believe that the media, new media like the printing press or visual prints, the ability to make prints in abundance from one plate and so on, are responsible for this change in sensibility in the West that we call our modernization or rationalization, and that it created something. But he says, the media tail off into 1,000,001 weird and wonderful things. The media, such as the printing press and perspectival drawing and the dissemination of diagrams and so on, all these things are important only insofar as they assist in the immobile mobile. They form stages of taking something, seeing what it's like over there in Sumatra, bringing it here to Amsterdam, putting it on a flat page, mixing it up with other information we have about currents and tides and rival companies, making a decision to basically invade the place. How can the whole world be brought into one small provincial town called Amsterdam? Create the Dutch East India Company, one of the most extraordinary multinationals. I mean, there is no multinational today even remotely like the Dutch East India Company. It's like several large superpowers. How did a small provincial town, Boksburg, Brakpan, Springs, Benoni, how did a small bunch of people in those small towns get it together to be able to successfully dominate, to observe from afar and dominate and change the lives and successfully invade? Cortege is even more striking example. A handful of ragged mercenaries, mangy horses, outdated guns, etc., a lot of germs. How did they just devastate a subcontinent? Well, the question is information with paper, by pushing paper, by being able to have immobile mobiles, being able to take something from what things are like there, combine it with other things which we know, into something which has tremendous powers. And whether it is the colonial campaign or the periodic table, which allows us to integrate all the elements in the universe, not just on Earth, which we can dig up, but all these elements, what we know about the composition of stars. We know from inferring from star spectra and relating it to the periodic table. So we have an extraordinary power that comes not just from new media or new way of thinking or new concepts or experimental technique or whatever, because all these things existed for several centuries. Historians of science will tell you that the inductive method and the experimental method and whatever was alive and well in the Middle Ages. There was a Roger Bacon 3 centuries before Francis Bacon, not the painter, the inductivist philosopher. And Roger Bacon sounds very much like his later successor. So medieval thought was as scientific, as conceptual, as observational, as rational. But it didn't have something which could take it to a critical mass, where quickly you could get the information out, you could shuffle the information, you could scale it, coordinate it, superimpose it, in such a way that you could enlist everybody to it. By saying, I'm so confident that we can invade India and pull it off. And we make this decision. This decision was made by someone who had never set foot outside of England, and never did. The conquest of India by the Brits was entirely devised in the living room, just as the conquest of global warming right now is devised in little hotel rooms in Davos. and the problem is no bigger than a pumpkin. So this immense concentration of things at a distance coming along reliable roads to us, coalescing with allies in the form of other facts or other information, but also other stakeholders who want to use this information. Suddenly it forms the basis for an absolutely reliable consensus. We say it's a fact. We say it's objective, only because the cost of challenging it is so high. Which is not to say that some people with ambition don't set out to explicitly challenge these things in the field of science. But they would need a backing as long as the network itself, if not longer. When it's cheap and easy, such as the difference between membrane theory and string theory, where no one's going to experiment on this, all you need is mathematicians, pencils, and a dustbin. There is a joke that when they were setting up the Advanced Studies Institute, you must have heard this joke, at Princeton, the endower, the money bags person, said, what should we get? Chemists, no, they need laboratories. Physicists, no, they need all kinds of complicated things. I said, well, philosophers, all they need, no, mathematicians was the suggestion. All they need is pencil and paper and a dustbin. So the next suggestion, no, don't get mathematicians, get philosophers, because they don't use the dustbin. So the cost of the chain, this high-level cosmological physics or whatever, is such a turbulent field, because the chain you are capturing is a mathematical chain with a bit of experimental physics or other physics theory regions as your collateral. But if it were an experiment, if it involved experiment, in fact, would involve devising universes to order, then you'd see it would be as costly as challenging the physics of medium-sized dry goods, which is seldom challenged, because it is very costly to overturn all the steps. It's the end of a very long and continuous chain. So back to the printing press. Changes in media, and the ones that Latour cites here are perspectival systems. Prints, the ability to duplicate the same image and disseminate it, and of course the printing press, which integrates the diagram and the word. He says that one of the most striking effects of the printing press on science is on the great Danish astronomer royal, Tycho Brahe, who, as you know, had his nose cut off in a duel, so he had this wonderful silver nose, prosthetic nose. He kept a deer as a pet and fed it beer, and was very upset when it fell down the stairs and killed itself. He was a generally very flamboyant character. He spent less time observing anything, even though he was one of the last of the great pre-telescopic natural observers, but spent a great deal of time assembling materials. And he was fortunate, thanks to the printing press, to be able to assemble these materials from manuscripts going back to the ancient Egypt and so on, not in manuscript form, but in printed form. Because people would print these things, copy them, print them, and send them to him from all over the world, whereas the manuscript itself was probably owned by a king somewhere, inaccessible, etc. So he had all these extraordinary printed versions of the whole history of astronomical observations and tables. So he could harmonize the stars into one notation. He could harmonize the times and the degrees into one notation, and he could put his own notation into this. And once he put his own notation into this, he could see such a huge discrepancy between previous observations and his own that he was able to start to challenge the assumption of an Ptolemaic system with epicycles and start to pave the observational way for people like Copernicus and Kepler to propose a heliocentric system. Nobody observed it. In fact, it's probably unobservable. But the very mistakes that were accumulated allowed him to propose something else. If his results had harmonized with everything else, if he could not see mistakes so clearly thanks to all these materials coming from different sources, if they'd come from one source who kindly fudged the data for his benefit of his master, he might have continued with a non-heliocentric view, with a Ptolemaic view. So where does this all lead? It leads to the idea that all these chains of results are superimposable. If you want to know the relationship between the New York Stock Exchange and natural resources, you could map all the mining sites in New York onto the various investment sites on today's stock exchange. You could never do that some other way. You can only do that by having refined them, put them into some kind of tabular form or some kind of consistent notation, and superimpose the chains on one another. So the superimposition of chains upon one another is the great power of the system. And this system that I've described, and that Latour describes, of course, and has the presence of mind to see and take seriously, is nothing but the system of mobile immobiles. It's a way of looking at a distance. It's a way of having something, not literally, but bringing it here. The issue of specimens, brought back, skinned, taxidermed, chlorophylled, pickled, whatever, is synonymous with the voyages of so-called voyages of discovery, whereas Jacob Zuma says the colonials discovered themselves. And the issue of maps is not a matter of going out and drawing a map, but going out with every map, and as you go, correcting every map. So it's a matter of superimposition and of recruiting past maps into the present map by correcting them. So the issue of paperwork lies at the root of modern medicine. And here Latour cites the great study on the birth of the clinic, on the birth of modern medicine by Michel Foucault, a great historian of science, where in fact Foucault is saying it's not that doctors suddenly got different concepts or got to see things in different ways. The same doctor with the same eyes who just happens to see the sore stomachs and the broken arms in this class would carry on thinking that way. But when such things as plagues and epidemics come to town, and the state demands that doctors document every case, a pile of paperwork grows up. A dossier on the plague grows up. Now this dossier on the plague becomes the framework for understanding health and disease. We can then, by manipulating and cascading this dossier into typical results, extracting from these case studies more general accounts, we can start to see norms emerging where the accounts converge. And in the cascade, we're able to say something objective for the first time about disease, and then cut bodies open. Autopsy is a new thing. Cut bodies open in the post-mortem, it was not done. Cut bodies open to verify what we had discerned in the paperwork. And remember, the paperwork is a set of case files put together. And the hospital is in fact an institution that expresses the form of knowledge glimpsed for the first time in the set of case files. The beds, the wards, the hierarchies, the record keeping, etc. It is an internalized set of mobile immobiles based on the file, which is the mobile immobile of the plague in a town. So the hospital is a town, plague town, and its administration uplifted and architecturally implanted in a new institution, hence modern medicine. And other examples. Foucault shows that punishment in our society changes from a very visible representative of the king cutting someone in half, and you've all seen Braveheart. A lot of people want to cut up Mel Gibson, I'm sure. But that kind of Braveheart situation where you've got an anonymous crowd and you've got a very individuated person, their crimes are constantly being hung around their neck, and how they are cut up is to reflect their crime, and if they do this, they'll cut off this or cut off that, whatever. One individual, exemplifying a punishment. The system changes to an anonymous system, where in fact one or two individuals observe everybody and everything about them in the prison. When you're in prison, you're under constant observation, and you become the subject of a case, the subject of an intense documentation. So the more power that's exerted on you in our modern societies, the more is known about you, the more information is gathered about you in order to exert that power. And so the prison becomes a kind of organization that shares features, according to Jeremy Bentham, shares features with the factory, where an invisible observer can make a crowd visible in their work, with the school, think about the modern school, with the hospital, with the psychiatric clinic, etc. So you can spend your life going seamlessly from the school to the factory, to the prison, back to the factory, to the hospital, to the factory, to the psychiatric clinic, etc. And eventually, highly normalized, opt out and die. So for Latour, these new institutions, such as the prison, are in fact expressions of a bureaucratic power, the ability to keep records on individuals, such that in keeping records on individuals, you both individuate them, you're keeping a fat file on them, but by aligning the files and cascading them in the right way, you are extracting norms. You all know norms very well. The class average is a norm which hangs above all of you. Right? The class average is in fact something extracted from your individual, records of delinquency or of non-compliance. And then the class average somehow mysteriously appears as a result of this. So record keeping on individuals is probably the source of norms, and organizations like the factory, the modern school, the hospital and the prison and so on, are architectural expressions or spatial expressions of the kind of visibility, the kind of mobile immobiles, the immobilization of sight, the structuring of seeing into data that goes with this kind of bureaucratic system of record keeping. So the bureaucratic power requires a certain visibility to be maintained architecturally, and it requires a certain mentality, a certain administrative skill in record keeping and in comparison. And so on and so on and so on and so on and so on, with many examples. Now, this piece you have to read. Those of you delinquents who have not read, you must read, because all of these issues don't get any traction unless as discussions of the modern, of how we conceive of ourselves as modern. And the modern, as you can see, is a highly contentious thing. Few people agree. In fact, most thinkers of the modern profile themselves by almost overturning what somebody else had thought. And you often find traces of the predecessor in somebody like Max Weber, who is one of the founders of modern sociology, talking about the rationalization and the Entzauberung, the disenchantment of modern society and its iron cage of bureaucratic rule, and so on and so forth. You can see clearly that he's overturning the far more happy and optimistic rationalization of society that we find in his predecessor Hegel. And there's this constant intermodulation of people having the best stab at the modern and correcting the modern, etc. And Latour is one of the more recent people to be correcting the modern, to be saying it is not made up of a sudden discovery of personal freedom, or a sudden commitment to personal freedom to the point where the state becomes the safeguarder of personal freedom and rights, where the market becomes the expression of individual preference, and so on, and individual private property, and so on. He's saying the conception that the modern has of itself is far too strongly based on the agent, and what we think the powers of the agent, the powers of the person can be. And I mean, this is very understandable, because in some ways the revolutionary inceptions of the modern, French and the American revolutions, are synonyms for freedom. They emancipate the agent to be everything the agent can be. Economically, you'll be Donald Trump. Personally, you will have privacy and self-realization and self-fulfillment. You will own yourself right down to the last details. You'll be responsible for yourself. You will shape your life in a transparent way without metaphysical help. You will have your interaction in society safeguarded, but not constrained by the state, upholding your rights and so on. So there is a general emancipation of the individual and a foregrounding of the individual as a tremendous power to change modern society, because the individual, in a sense, is the defining stake of early modern society. And in a sense, one should not dismiss this focus or be blasé about it, because we are standing on the top of the achievements. In a way, we have Latour and Foucault and these other approaches that are not human-centered, that are not part of a humanistic project of elaborating the individual, because in some sense the individual has done its work in modernity. It has achieved so much. We are indeed an individual-centered society. I think you all have an instinctual horror of a more anonymous form of society, or society in which recognition as individuals would be impossible. The great bugbear in this country is collectivism. You just have to say collectivism and you become Helen Zille's shadow, minister of justice. But do not underestimate what an individual-centric epistemology, what an individual-centered institutions have achieved. But having done what they've done, they also show us clearly the limitations. It is not down to the poor individual to anchor all of reality and have reality at their disposal, the way colonial powers have, or the way powerful states have when they go to war. We cannot conceive of how an individual, however Promethean they might be, however ambitious, however driven, however compelling and persuasive they might be, simply persuading other individuals and making from this individual coalition a Nazi party, or the Communist International, or the apartheid state, or English colonialism. The individual is not that kind of thing. The individual is not even a place that is a suitable site for the transition from pre-modern to modern. Many people say that one of the great thinkers of the individual, who you see resonating through Habermas's classic account, is Immanuel Kant. And his three critiques of pure reason look at the powers of the individual to discipline their mind and their experience in such a way that they may follow the path of irrationality in their moral deeds, in their politics, in their quest for objective knowledge, and in their aesthetic, the autonomy we spoke about. So we've had some extraordinary brilliant focusing on the individual and expectation of the individual. If it was some kind of egg that would hatch this Jurassic Park of the modern. But it's not that it never hatched. For fascism and communism, the egg was rotten or it never hatched. Or we shouldn't hatch it. We should look for some other kind of way of understanding the common or the format of where things happen. But indeed it did hatch. The United States of America is a society based upon the individual and on the culture of rights, predicated on the individual. And those of you who read Rawls' Theory of Justice this weekend for relaxation will see just how far a liberal conception of the individual and of rights can go into shaping very powerful, beautiful and viable visions of society. But we have the Latours, we have the Foucaults, we have the Nietzsches, etc. Because there is a suspicion that the individual was not the appropriately equipped site of transition from the pre-modern to the modern. And that whatever happens to the individual, we're not going to go back to the pre-modern. But in some sense, we have gone back to the pre-modern, even though we are still the same kind of individuals we thought we were, or your parents thought you'd be, or thought they were in 1980, or whenever you were conceived. When were you conceived? What is the average age of this class? 23, 24. So you were conceived in the old regime. It's the last desperate attempt to populate the barricade. Fortunately, you've swum into more hospitable waters. Despite, and this is the predicament, despite fully realized individuality, despite a tremendous culture of rights and a consensus about rights throughout the world, and despite having pretty good lives, pursuing yourselves and realizing yourselves in your individuality, we nevertheless have the world, or our conception of the world, becoming pre-modern. As we saw from last time, the great taboo, the defining, if you like, two commandments of the modern is don't mix nature and the person. And we've seen nothing but hybrids. According to Latour's account, there's never been a moment when they were unmixed. So we have achieved individuality. It's not like we're in the position of a generation after World War I, like the Dadaists, saying something has not, something has failed. We need to still realize humanity. We need to still liberalize. We need to still find some platform for the future. Or people after World War II saying that, things are so blighted institutionally. We need to find the individual. We need to refine and express things from a whole new premise. We're not in a situation. We've had tremendous advances in human rights. This country is one shining example. You've all seen Robert De Niro, Whoopi Goldberg, Bill Clinton waxing orgasmic on the History Channel about the upcoming series on the South African miracle. Okay. Oh, and that guy with the pink glasses. What's his name? There you go. The amateur economist. Part-time musician. South Africa is a shining example of liberal individualism and of institutions of liberal individualism. And yet the entire world, thanks to the ecological prospect, seems to go back to the 17th century, where we cannot mix up things enough. The red tuna has its own political constituency on the internet. Everything is of a hybrid order. And yet we still pursue the individual, but the individual is less and less of a guide, or less and less of an intuitive framework for understanding what is going down in this society. And of course, it's Latour's point that this project, which sets out as an imperial project, it's a project of knowing what kind of fruit are they growing down there that we can come and grow it here and collect it into the great botanical catalogues at Kew Gardens, or how do we inventory the world, because we need gold, we need silver, we need this, we need that. The same curiosity that goes on now about the DRC. How do we inventory nature? How do we make nature into a storehouse? How do we create this great encyclopedic ideal? If you think about Hegel, if you think about the great encyclopedic ideals of the West, the Bible in its different iterations and its different Abrahamic religions that iterated is not encyclopedic. Despite what creationists say, it doesn't try and provide an integral account of everything. But Dante's use of the Bible in the 13th century Italy is encyclopedic. He wants to give an absolutely comprehensive account of all possible human fates everywhere that human fates might be involved. In hell, in purgatory, which is here, where the coffee is cold, and of course in Paradiso, which is the most short and boring of the three books. But this Divina Commedia, this idea of a divine, of this destinies, human destinies interlaced with the ontology of the time, is encyclopedic. You can find out exactly what a particular sin will get you in hell, and you can get it excellently described. And then later, the 19th century, the high century of mobile immobiles, would start to yearn after the most encyclopedic organizations of knowledge. A novelist like Balzac wanted to write the entire Paris into his novels, every possible human type and every type of relation. Hegel is in fact simply Kantianism encyclopedized. He wanted to make an inquiry in which absolutely everything could feature in human history and play its role. Nothing would be excluded. Now that is an example of the mobile immobiles being drawn to one place, in the case of Hegel, civil society, in the case of Balzac, the novel, in the case of Dante, this classico-Christian cosmology, which is essentially a novel, a great poem. So the Western encyclopedism is really based upon the wish to know how things are at a distance. The science of astronomy looks at things at the edge of the universe. We'll never get there, and yet we know absolutely everything about them. We manage to translate everything we know about them, spectrally, gravitationally, etc., into a very small box of tricks, where we can manipulate the results and we can propose different universes and reel it backwards and reel it forward, etc. So from astronomy to Vasco da Gama, exactly the same thing is going on in the West. The mobile immobile, the wish to capture something pictorially, numerically, diagrammatically, verbally, descriptively, bring it back, subject it to manipulations which make it very powerful. When people themselves were brought back, as with Sarah Bartman, as with the 100 Zulus who Queen Victoria requested the pleasure of and who never came back, and the Zulu diehards are very angry about this. Probably these guys like own dynasties of butcher shops or something in Glasgow. but basically, whenever the actual persons were brought back from these distant places, they were far from mobile immobiles. They either became court jesters, or they became victims of some kind of amorous intrigue, or they fell into the hands of the scientists, or they assimilated. So that shows you that kidnapping Ingmar and taking him back to my planet is not a mobile immobile. I need to inscribe him. I need anthropology. I need to leave him where he is with his weird camera and everything else. And I need to capture that on little cards from informants, and look at some missionary who speaks his language, who was there, and compare other visits and create filing cabinet around him and understand the tribe of Ingmars and leave him there. In fact, if he comes here, I've tainted his objectivity. There's no point in Ingmar setting up a fish and chip shop in London, because then he's just become one of us. Now that divide is something that you have to understand characterizes the system. And we speak jokingly about the human chattel, the human victims and captors of the system. But we are speaking about colonialism in its entirety. Because what this system means for astronomy is that we know far more about distant galaxies than distant galaxies will ever know about themselves. They don't enter into comparisons, documentations, scaling, superimposition, tabulation and reshuffling, geometrization, mathematical formalization, and other manipulations which centralize this into a superfact. In fact, they're perfectly innocent. Now, when it comes to international relations, which is a synonym for colonialism in the last 4 centuries, you can see that the people themselves, when they come to the metropole centers, just cannot feature. There are endless accounts of anthropologists bringing their informants back home. And it's like trying to transport black forest cake on a monocycle in a howling wind across both North and South Poles to the middle of the Mojave Desert. You may be left with some trifle. Okay. So the interesting thing about the mobile immobiles is that things move around, but only in pictures, within a route, a channel, a framework that we define and that we manage. Every transformation I've discussed here is a strategy for managing a channel. And we can put our heads in that channel and say it's the world, and we're at the center of the globe. This is the sphere in which we exist. And from within that channel, which we've created for ourselves and air-conditioned and maintained, We can manipulate everything in the channel. We can send information back. Demographics come this way, troops go that way, informed by the demographics. They are not just troops arriving on a shore, they are troops arriving to carry out a carefully choreographed plan based on fact, based on observation, more than the islanders could ever wish to or bother to assemble about themselves, because islanders are not trying to know things at a distance. They don't maintain such systems. They know what they need to know. But we maintain that knowledge at a distance. And I want you to sense how strikingly artificial this is. And when we try to bring these specimens into the picture, one-on-one, ich und du, and now we are suddenly having this big harmony, we destroy them. Or we destroy our objectivity, we destroy our grasp. It is like those radioactive manipulating chambers, or it is like those spaceships where you can't step out without an extravehicular suit, or you'll just explode. We cannot bring the people, the planet, into this sphere. It is an incredibly powerful sphere of representations. We can only send our ballistic consequences that way, or devastating consequences, or managerial consequences, or extractive consequences, or verificational consequences that way. And we can bring those places all to Amsterdam, which at that point becomes the center of the world, or London, or Pretoria. Pretoria was the center of the world. Has been, still is for all I know. Maybe always will be. Maybe they'll make a movie with Sean Connery as a big dragon coming back to the center of the world, coming out of that big memorial with the flagpoles and saying, you know, this is the cosmic egg, it's Pretoria. For the purposes of administration, with your union buildings, etc., you were construing yourselves as the point where all chains of mobile immobiles converge, and where they inform a decision-making capacity for the whole of Africa. When Cecil Rhodes arrived, he was like any investor today, saying, if I'm on the South African stock market, I've got all of Africa at my doorstep. The real distinction is what kind of creature emerges where these things converge. That creature is us, that is the modern Westerner. The modern Westerner is a functionary who maintains this crazy machine of representations, of coherences, of shufflings, whether it is all the instruments of the world converging in the orchestra. If you think about the history of something as simple as the oboe, the little double reed comes from a Sicilian bagpipe, and the valved barrel comes from another peasant instrument. In what space do two totally regionalized peasant instruments converge and become one super instrument that can cut through all the orchestral textures? The history of the violin. It was a specialty of Sephardic Jews in Spain who found themselves scattered all over, and no doubt could make any kind of violin. And then it becomes integrated into something else. We're not just talking about knowledge and colonial administration here, a sort of galactic war of colonialism based on objective knowledge. We are talking about all of our artistic institutions. Our galleries are simply huge storehouses of carefully tabulated and carefully self-representing loot taken from all over the world. There is nothing in the West that, once you start looking at it, that does not conform to this logic of mobile immobiles, except the people on the outside of the system. And with that, we smoke break. So I think even from my rather disparate summary of this piece, you can see how far we've come from the core philosophical assumptions about modernism when it comes to reflect on itself and account for itself. Its core belief is that somehow We were like sleepwalkers in the 17th century, and we woke up to a world of facts and of objectivity about ourselves. We saw ourselves as finite agents, finite individuals having finite powers and having to manage these powers in the most rational way we could, to having to discipline ourselves to know nature, to become objective and not fall subject to bias, and so on and so on and so on and so forth, which is filtered down in a way into the kind of common sense, dogmatic, knee-jerk account of what makes us different. But in Latour's account, of course, facts, or what we believe are facts, are very carefully managed. They have their own transport routes. They have their own buildings and architectures. They have their own type of filing system. They have their own type of geometry. They have their own type of illustration. They have their own type of integration with words. They have their own type of manipulations. They have their own kind of cost and accounting. Let's not forget that money is one of the great mobile immobiles scattered around the world in the colonial system. Even though Latour says it doesn't carry much information, it's able to give a kind of right angle determination of the cost of each part of this chain. So Latour has us moderns construed as these strange creatures straight out of the pages of Gulliver's Travels, who are maintaining a very complex, finely adjusted voyeurism. We're not opening our eyes and finding the world and suddenly finding ourselves and saying, hurrah, we are secular, let's get on with it. Let's wait for Descartes and Immanuel Kant to give us the instruction book of our new factual and objective status. In fact, we are massive contrivers, immense contrivers, far closer to the astronomers, trying to document faithfully something at a great distance. Our institutions are far more like telescopes or cameras than common sense or freedom. And the benefit that we gain, why would we embark on what in itself is a very costly exercise? Why maintain this very unhandy thing? It brings to mind what people say about a boat. They say the happiest day is when you buy it, and then the second happiest day is when you sell it. So the Enlightenment we could have been very happy to have these new vistas and free from a certain kind of political control and a kind of mythic universe and so on. Very happy day. But why did we continue this laborious investment? Why did we, in fact, enslave ourselves to rules and regulations and norms and this tremendous management task? We are not only managing one another, but we manage our knowledge systems. We manage who may speak and with what authority. We manage who is spoken of, what may be included within these kinds of discussion. There's nothing freewheeling about it, and we have this tremendous archival management of the past. For a futuristic, free, undetermined type of society as we portray ourselves, we have an obsessive interest in maintaining social memory. We archive everything. We keep records. We consolidate our records. We restore our works of art. We restore our buildings. We investigate our institutions historically, long after they have lapsed from our society. We feel that something irretrievable is lost. If a page of a Beethoven manuscript goes up in flames or a Van Eyck painting is burnt during a bombing spree in Dresden. So we have a tremendous sense of the past. We are the most historicist culture ever, despite priding ourselves on freedom, secularity, fresh beginnings, and innovation. And this concern with the past is merely to give authority to these chains converging on the present. We enlist the past and institutionalize the past in our archives, our museums, etc., in order to give authority and to provide more subtle comparisons and manipulations and greater provenance and pedigree to what we are constantly collecting in the present. And what we are collecting in the present is very different to the picture of modern consciousness, which is supposed to know itself best of all. If you think of Descartes, the one overwhelming message that comes out of Descartes is that consciousness of the knowing subject is best known to itself. What consciousness grasps with absolute certainty is some aspect of itself. And having done that, it can move within the space of all knowledge, holding this certainty as a kind of benchmark or touchstone or guarantee. So contrary to the picture that the closest thing to us in our knowledge is ourselves. We wake up in the morning, know who we are, we're in a factual universe, there are no dragons to be got rid of, there are no impending beliefs or metaphysical clashes. We open our eyes, we are empirical. In fact, we are living at the other end of a telescope. What we know best is what is absolutely furthest away. The foundation of our knowledge is extreme alterity. If we know reason, it's because we studied madness in the 17th and 18th century and institutionalized it and documented it in every detail. Since then, poor philosophy has been trying to do a similar fine-grained job on reason, with no success. So we tend to have the closest connection to what is furthest away. And this entire exercise of Latour is proof of that connection, if you like, what Judith Butler would call a kind of performative proof. Because he himself is not approaching the West as a historian. He's not approaching it from inside experience and history as a philosopher. He's not approaching it from the perspective of its past or its events or its narratives. He's approaching it as an anthropologist. He's saying we have failed to be symmetrical in our anthropology. We apply a certain protocol to societies very unlike our own and very distant from our own. And then we refuse to apply that protocol to ourselves. Again, this issue of symmetry, which has been so destructive and fascinating weapon in his hands, insisting on symmetry. Last time we saw how insisting on the society-nature symmetry, human, non-human symmetry, led to a completely revised account of what there is. And here too, he's operating as an anthropologist who is focused on the most distant and now turns the anthropological or the ethnographic quest onto the modern scientific laboratory, modern bureaucracy, etc., etc., etc. So he's trying to use modernism's own distancing from itself, the fact that it always starts with the most remote, in order to gain a further perspective on modernism itself. He's attempting the ethnography of the moderns, and he keeps saying rhetorically, why have we not done this? We ethnographize everything. Our natural mode of knowledge and thinking and acting is colonial. We are the tadpoles that swim in the colonial pond. We are the salmon spawned of the colonial, and whenever we want to understand our societies, we head off to a Johnny Clegg concert. Just to some sort of ancestral spawning ground. Well, the fact is that this perspectivism is something you should not miss. The fact that something very far away that comes through complex mediations is what is most factual to us, what is most certain to us, what is most reliable to us, what we're prepared to form alliances on. We are far more able to organize a war in Afghanistan than we can police our own underground railway transport systems. We are far more equipped as a society to send troops to Mali or wherever the latest venture is tonight, and to run the logistics of that program, than to send troops or police to Marikana without shooting everybody up. So there is a strange inversion which has to do with the fact that our knowledge is assembled from mobile immobiles, comes towards the center, and as it comes closer to the center, it gets subject to or prepared for more and more manipulations. I think there are 10 or 11 which he spells out, and it's worth your while. In fact, I do insist that you apply each of these transformations to what you do in architecture, and ask yourself whether architecture would be even possible without a fixation on the most remote. What is the most remote in architecture that gave rise to modern architecture? Obviously, the Greeks. Have you ever considered why you didn't wake up and say, we're Heideggerians, we are interested in hands, tools, space, whatever, etc. Why did it take, sort of Norberg Schultz to say, knock, knock, knock? There's this kind of immediacy and presence, whatever, in architecture. Architecture, in fact, starts with the most remote. It starts with a retrieval of the classical. And a full codification of the classical has happened, and a full exegesis of Vitruvius has happened by the time the Renaissance comes to a close. And when Mies van der Rohe uses this absolutely unprecedented tectonic of steel and glass, he keeps referring back to the forms of classical typology to justify himself. So in a sense, architecture too is centered on the most remote, and its objectivity consists of bringing the most remote through a number of processes and a number of manipulations. We cannot subject the present and the immediate Lebenswelt to those levels of transformation. It is too much like herding cats. Okay? The cat herdingness of the present. Latour even has a name for it. He says it's a plasma. He said if the chains of what we do manage, think about the cold chain. When everyone gets diarrhea, you go to your supermarket manager to complain. And he says, there have been problems with the cold chain. It means something thawed out and then got refrozen and then became a bacterial soup or a petri dish before you ate it, right? But you see that for instant pudding, there's a cold chain. And the management of the cold chain is very important. For court cases, there is a thing called the chain of custody for evidence. If the chain of custody for evidence is broken, the evidence is not admissible in court. So imagine all of our reality is like that, but having its inception far away, because there's absolutely no stability in the close by. In fact, we live our close by analogy with the far away. That is why in the French Revolution, when the great modern painter David was commissioned to portray the revolution, he didn't show the people he knew, like we know each other in this room. He portrayed a bunch of Romans, the Oath of Horatio, the Three Swords, and the new Roman society. And in fact, they went around dressed up as Romans, just as here we go around dressed up as comrades. Lenin in 1917 is better understandable to us than the present. So it's not that we are somehow by choice antiquarian or nostalgic, whatever, but that we do in a strange way make our present in the rearview mirror. And that the closest to the present it is, the more we tend to speak about the present by analogy. And then the most difficult thing is speaking about the present as the present. That's why Habermas is so impressed with artists and the autonomy of art, because it attempts to engage with the present. Something which we now understand why this is so difficult. So in the Latourian perspective, it literally is a change in perspective, because we are managing a system that provides us with power, domination, knowledge, strategy, flexibility, calculability, provides us with tremendous benefits where it converges. But in order to converge successfully, it must go through a number of refinements. And its objectivity depends upon distance, because the effort of going out of your way to get that gives it greater authority than what you wake up and see in the morning. So you must see yourselves in architecture as in a carapace. And you must see photography rather than perception, perhaps as a better metaphor of your situation, because photography almost grew up within this conception of knowledge. It's a perfect invention, photography and film, for this conception of knowledge. Think about editing a film, something that this gentleman knows a lot about. What do? You have it in a common format. You throw out the various takes where you have shifts of angle, or you have different lens, etc. You harmonize them and homogenize them, and you jump straight back and forth across time, even shooting out of sequence for the plot, and you glue it together into an extremely coherent story. Whereas we tend to think that the narrative comes first and then you fit the film to it. Film is a perfectly tabular reality that you can make more real than real by gluing the bits together, putting them together in a way where they have been made unifiable and superimposable. In fact, if you wanted to be perfectly pretentious and get a humanities PhD, and second one, you could then write about how photography and film are perfect exemplars of this kind of Latourian chain of mobile immobiles, and how all the various transformations which he carries out are carried out almost in a kind of little Frankenstein laboratory around film. And it is interesting, by the way, and he does comment on this, that early on in the system, think about Renaissance paintings. You see a church in Rome, you document it in an image, you take the image and you build the church in London. You document the church in London, you take it back to Rome in order to compare. He says that this system does not distinguish between the fictitious and the non-fictitious. It is a common space in which the fictitious and the erroneous and the possible can dwell in exactly the same formats as the actual. So part of its power is that in one stroke it encompasses the fabulous, the mythic, the fictitious, the literal and the descriptive, the possible. Think about designing a machine in central projection. Every part of the machine can be specified, and each part can be sent to different manufacturers all over the world and then brought together as per the drawing and assembled. So you could distribute possible states and you could examine possible machines in the drawing. And so you have a combination of all modalities, the fictional, the possible, the descriptive, the downright impossible, the false, within these environments. There was a very hot debate in the realm of computer science where a guy called David Deutsch and an even crazier guy called Frank Tipler, I hope they're not watching this on YouTube, proposed that with powerful enough computation, say you enlisted all the molecules in the universe, and it would take a very Latourian system to see the universe is made up of all molecules. But say you could enlist them, you could then use the end of the universe to power up a supercomputation and resurrect everybody in a more favorable virtual environment. Why would we do this? Because our super grandchildren would feel sorry for us, having lived without, having suffered, having lived in this relatively deprived environment. So we'd all be resurrected in this supercomputing thing. And as the violence of this end of the universe thing happens, so you'd have more energy, the more computational power, and therefore you'd hang in a kind of eternity in this machine. Now that's not the important bit. David Deutsch, who you may know is a pioneer of quantum computation in the real world, got into the debate, and he said, based on Gödel's theorem, he said, given the impossibility of certain logical configurations, are there certain virtual environments that are impossible? He asked a very old world question. Archimedes asked, are there certain kinds of mechanism which are impossible? And Deutsch said, are there certain kinds of virtual environments which are impossible? Could a virtual environment include itself, for instance? And so on. Now, you might say this is a discussion about reality or some future state of reality. But in a way it is a discussion that's been there all the time in this mobile-immobile space, because this mobile-immobile space integrates all the modalities in which something can exist: fictional, future, possible, descriptive, and impossible, paradoxical, or self-contradictory. So what looks like a very futuristic discussion about the physics of immortality and so on turns out to be a kind of delving back into the wackier aspects of the structure of modern knowledge, which is not a mental or conceptual structure. That is what's so scandalous in Latour. It is an institutional structure. It's like a library, a laboratory, a prison, a voyage of discovery. You are more likely to understand what trust and credit mean by eavesdropping on what people say on the internet than you are by looking deep into the human soul. So the way Latour works something out is that he says it all has an institutional form. It all has some kind of chain. This chain is not a metaphor. It consists of particular things which translate something into something else. And that abstraction is not something that happens behind your eyes and in your head. He says abstraction is a potential that everything has in relation to everything else. For instance, if I put a match to this DSTV remote control, which is perhaps the 200th that I've purchased, thanks to this fast-forward switch falling off on a regular basis. If I put a match to this, let's say we just burn the cover so that I don't inconvenience myself. If I burn this cover, the flame abstracts from this cover. The flame merely combusts what is combustible here. It doesn't combust the transparency, it doesn't combust the bubbles, it doesn't combust the rectangular shape. It merely combusts what is combustible. The flame knows nothing about the blue cotton that I put in it. It merely abstracts from all of that and only deals with or mediates or creates the next event, which is a fire, out of some combustible thing, and completely disregards these. So that, and Latour and his great commentator, Graham Harman, are full of examples of this kind. So in fact, abstraction is a result of aligning things to things in an appropriate way, not of the head intervening in the process. Concepts are not in your head. All the degrees of abstraction come from tabulating and connecting things to one another such that you shed a certain property there, which might be a mutable or variable property, and you carry only the essential property across. Take crash testing. When you crash test, you don't start the engine, you don't have a simulated driver. For the purposes of the crash test, everything you need to know can happen by towing the car along with a cable into a concrete block at a certain speed, yes? But imagine how difficult it would be to then replace that form of propulsion in all cars. You'd have to have roadways with special pulleys and cables, like tramways, pulling your cars around. So for purposes of a crash test, you can abstract everything important about the safety and crushability of the car by simply towing it in a straight line into a concrete block. You don't have to simulate driver usage, the road system, typical accidents, etc. So the very fact of abstraction is a configuration of the car and a cable. It's not that somebody then abstracts from that data. That collision is an abstract collision. It's already cut away from unimportant variables. If you want to put back those variables, you have to get rid of the cable and you have to start the motor and drive the car and put one of those soft machines in called humans. So in this chain, it's not that this chain is just a convenient delivery system like pizzas or DHL that brings something to the scientist who then in some rational sense applies their mind to the matter. By the time this chain has done its work, this is already a concept. It is ready, it's geometricized, it is two-dimensionalized, it is in a comparative state, it is simple to formalize it, and the formalizations can be carried out by a computer and give you the results that you want. What is the GDP? What is the national economy? There is no point from which you can observe the national economy. You have to number crunch a certain number of indirect indicators, get them into a similar form, tabulate them, and from that extract that thing called the national economy. Many of you might have wondered why the census took so long to come out. But the census, that was merely the mobile that knocked at your door with a ballpoint pen and a questionnaire. A whole set of processes had to happen in order for that to become a valid model of the population. It was statistical transformations and integrations on the same scale and superimpositions and error corrections that made that a fact. The facts were not in your living room when you filled in the census. So this system abstracts. this system converges. And where it converges, it gives an unreasonable power to those few people who use the maximum number of its resources in order to know how things are at a distance, in time or in space, and to know how to act on those things in modalities such that those things cannot act on themselves. A very striking example that's in your reading from Sloterdijk. Sloterdijk, like Latour, is very avid about exploring these domains in which we have experience. And he's as interested in saying that our experience is artificial. But if we try to do without this artifice, we wouldn't have experience. And Sloterdijk's interesting observation is that when biologists in 1907 come up with the concept of the environment is what is necessary for the organism to survive. The environment must be a certain way. The technologists then decided that this must be true of cockroaches. Therefore, instead of killing individual cockroaches, which is what we all do intuitively, we declare war on cockroach individuals. We will declare war on the cockroach environment. We will make the cockroach environment inhospitable to cockroaches. And so comes a great period in Western history of delousing, deroaching, etc., and various regulations that become practical for the first time to police the extent to which you've uprooted insects and vermin and so on from the environment. But before long, the military strategists have decided, why sit in trenches in World War I and declare war on individuals by trying to shoot them with a bullet in such a laborious way? Why not simply make their environment unlivable? So declare war on the environment. So create what people at the time described as an airquake, like an earthquake. Simply pour chlorine gas over the trenches so that no one can breathe. And thereafter, the birth of modern design. Modern design is conceived in order to make the environment more livable. So you design gas masks for your site with filters so that they can go in that environment, thanks to a tremendous piece of design. And they can do the body count. But without a gas mask, you don't have an environment. For the first time ever, the environment for your troops is put in a piece of design, in the gas mask. So they go into the gas with an environment, but your enemy is divorced from the environment and completely destroyed. And so on in Sloterdijk's very fascinating argument, where the extermination model through gassing gets applied directly to the Nazi genocides. And the contemporary war is a war on the environment. Now, what is an environment in that sense? This network is Latour's word, if you like, for a comparable environment. There are no facts outside that environment, just as there's no survival without a gas mask, or outside a spaceship without a spacesuit. If you step outside of that environment, it's not that you know things more directly, it's that you know nothing. Your ability to know, your ability to orientate yourself, even your ability to tell yourself the modernist myths convincingly, disappears. So you are locked in. These are the rails on which our experience is structured. So it's not a simple matter of saying, we'll be hippies, go back to the land, to hell with that, I'm going to ignore it wherever it happens. Because the very idea of it happens in this thing. We have created a sphere for ourselves, which we manage, even if we don't always understand it. So the question becomes the colonial question, as always in this country. If you don't ask the colonial question first and settle it to the best of your ability at that point, nothing else makes sense. Because unless you ask the colonial question, you will think you are at one of the centers of convergence. But in this country, you're at one of the centers where a convergence has relayed secondary information to you, and you have just enough to unpack the secondary information. But you don't have what it takes to create a convergence of your own. As a British colony, one of the British colonies in Africa, South Africa was allowed a certain participation in the strategies assembled in London. I remember London was formidable at assembling strategies. By Christopher Wren's time, they had assembled observations from all over the globe. They had established a marine timekeeping system and position-keeping system that depended only indirectly on celestial navigation. They had, Isaac Newton had dozens and dozens and dozens of observational informants to write his book Principia Mathematica. He was sitting in his study, but he was at the center of a network of dozens of informants who sent him letters for this thing which looks like it probably is the purest piece of theoretical physics we had for a long time. So London was a fantastic place to assemble things. London assembled a complete compendium of all the botanical types on the earth at Kew Gardens. So here is this convergence point. So convergence about Zulus, convergence about tribesmen in the Khyber Pass, convergence about Sudanese, etc., is nothing. So London puts it all together, mixes and matches, manages the chain, and then sends a instruction to Cape Town. Not today's instruction. Keep apartheid, make it comfortable for tourists. But it sends another instruction: wipe out the Xhosa people, push them back to such and such point, make an alliance with the Zulu king, invent a Zulu king, whatever the instruction might be. But they do not give the powers to short-circuit this chain and assemble them in Cape Town. You are merely the relay. You wait for the postman to come. You open the post and you say, I have instructions from the Queen to do such and such. Lord Kitchener, here are your instructions. Off you go and do it. Now, the most fascinating adventure in this country was the attempt to intercept the colonial chain and re-establish an autonomous center for it in the post-1961 Republic, which makes it even more fascinating episode in anti-colonial politics. Here are accidental, you've heard of the accidental tourist, here are accidental anti-colonialists who on the one hand seem so much like colonialists because what they are using and what they are consolidating in the only way that can be done in a center of power is the colonial chain. And it's inconceivable to them, even though they are indigenizers of the first order, and they try and force everyone around them into a path of indigenization or re-indigenization with the homelands. Once they are in this chain, it's inconceivable for them, despite their love of place, still echoed today in Norberg Schultz, by the way, wherever you are. At an Afrikaans university, you'll read Norberg Schultz, the love of the land, the love of the landscape, the love of place, whatever. Despite this powerful love of place, once the post-61 Republic had become a center of converging chains of mobile immobiles, it could never be on the ground. It could never be where it was. It could only converge elsewhere to what it assembled. And hence it could lead itself into conflagration without being aware that it was in the flames. Can you understand that? The peculiarity of South African history in this Latourian perspective is that you try and intercept the colonial system, you try and gain autonomy by bringing these by making your own objectivity, and yet in doing that you're stepping into a machine which can only be utopian, which can only be nowhere. It's the center of many other wheres. Hence today even in our institutions, which are the sum of these colonial institutions and anti-colonial colonial institutions, whatever we like to call them, we can refine that at some time. But even today we are obsessed with what is regional. We are hunting for the local the way some people hunt for the Yeti, as if there was $1 million prize, for bringing back a Yeti. Bring a Yeti to the White House and you'll be a celebrity. Well, we hunt for the local as if it were the Yeti. We sort of don't believe it exists. We are philosophically and architecturally obsessed with the regional, because the regional is the most difficult thing to think. Because what is our society? Our society is simply a convergence, former London, now Pretoria, now generalized to the whole of the society. We have not touched the ground. We are still managing a modern 18th century legacied chain. If you want to jump out of it, where are you jumping to? Hence we have this extraordinary problem of managing the fact that we are on one hand nowhere, but when we know where, we know everything. And if we're somewhere, we have the sense that we're going into darkness. And when we are a somewhere, the somewhere is always a mysterious liminal somewhere. Americans come to this country to lose themselves, to prove how non-imperialist they can be. After Vietnam, after Afghanistan, after Iraq, and so on. And then what do? They don't just relax and work constructively. They go off and they find some person willing to apprentice them as sangomas. They walk around with dreadlocks, get burnt in the hot sun, going on expeditions, go into mysterious caves, sacrifice animals, etc., etc. Because the somewhere other than the nowhere is always Gothic, it's always liminal, it's always mysterious, it's always incredibly exotic. It's as much a nowhere as the somewhere. We are trying to manage a shortcut out of this central space. And we want to be richly rewarded for it by some kind of mystical or revelatory knowledge. But what we need to do is understand what this space is, and not necessarily dismantle it, but make it work for us. It was conceived as a colonial apparatus. Our attempts to be post-colonial are ludicrous. I must tell you that I will upload for your amusement a commentary on, written in all seriousness, on phases of, what is it called? Post-colonial theory, whatever. Huh? The phases of post-colonial theory. What it has been since whatever until now. And it so happens that all these phases represent the 5 different phases in the work of Michel Foucault. So they latch onto one thinker and in a way think that they are progressing towards colonial reality by in fact winding themselves closer to the center of one late modernist thinker, Michel Foucault. I'll send it to you, you'll laugh. Next time you meet colonial, get that t-shirt that says post-colonial theory, telling the natives how they ought to think. It is nothing but a crazy involution, as crazy as Americans trying to become sangomas. It is nothing but a crazy involution within Western postmodernism, thinking that somehow it's an anti-modernism and not realizing how very modern the postmodern is there. It's just another extension of critique. So we have an interesting job because we are sitting not only with an incomplete republicanization, we're sitting with a kind of borrowed modernization since 1961 that has become willy-nilly generalized into a modern society of rights. And we're only gradually starting to understand what the institutional collateral of this thing is. We have thought our transition purely in humanist terms, purely in modernist terms. From our nature reserves, sending nature back to nature, sending facts back to nature, along what chain, I might ask, to our humanism of rights, propped up by what institutional framework? What creates the modern subject of rights? And we're wondering why our feet are dangling above the ground. And as we try to become more critical, so we become more modern. And as we become more modern, so we converge on the previous centers of colonial power in our thought style, whether it is London or the USA. And as we try to jump out of those centers, we jump from a nowhere to another nowhere. Mysticism, nostalgia, drugs, mental collapse, parochialism, regionalism, whatever, etc., and then come back and chat about those things, then we quickly restore to the modern consensus. So part of the reason why I'm so keen that you should read Latour is because I think that in spite of the strangeness, the counterintuitiveness of his arguments, I think that in this country, more than anywhere else in the world, we've kind of moved in our ice cutter into a kind of spontaneously Latourian experience. I think that we would find a Latourian compass to our experience immediately intelligible if we just undertook the task of reading him and discussing it and making it as common to your approach as modernist jargon and rhetoric is today. And to not get in the habit of trying to go upward and outward like our Sangoma friends through theory and try and get a synopsis. Because after all, synopses is something you do in London with Lord Kitchener and Queen Victoria. But trying to drill down and establish exactly what the nature of the chain is that makes architecture possible and sustain such a profession or such a particular objectivity or such a particular archive or particular repertory as architecture today. Rather than trying to make architecture into a metaphor for different things, we need to drill down into the very possibility of architecture here and see what kind of chain it represents and what kind of control you can take over that chain and what sort of variations you can play on that chain. Rather than receiving your instructions from New York. So really for this piece, read it 3 times. It will make little sense the first time round because it is a survey, a very clever survey. It is an example of what he talks about. It is an enlistment or recruitment of allies. He's writing sometime in the mid-1980s, and he recruits to his side revolution in art history, led by people like Michael Baxendale, and in this case by Svetlana Alpers, who writes an incredible book that you should all read called The Art of Describing, which shows how the whole mentality of the Dutch shifts in order to give rise to a certain kind of realism or observation at a distance, and is the foundation of Dutch imperial power, which is serious power. He then looks at a historian of prints, of how the visual print gets disseminated, a historian by the name of Ivans. And he looks at recent work by Elizabeth Eisenman, no relation, I believe, to the architect, on the role of printing in scientific knowledge. And he enlists the art historians and the media historians to his particular characterization of science, mainstream modern Western institution, defining modern Western institution, in terms of mobile, immobiles, and everything that follows from it. And he shows why you cannot simply say it's a matter of media history, art history, general history, etc. Why you have to find a way to walk outside the modernist assumptions that are so pervasive and understand how this very simple set of procedures, which are all very institutionalized, which you could have a museum of each one of these things, a museum of bureaucracy, a museum of specimen collecting, a museum of botany, whatever. They're all stuff. How it provides us with the different abstractions and powers to become a global commanding force in this artificial environment, in this gas mask, intellectual, experiential gas mask, if you like, that he describes in this article. So it is a masterpiece of exemplification. He does what he's talking about, and it is a central introduction, along with what we discussed last time, human, non-human symmetry. It's a focal introduction to what Bruno Latour is about. Probably the most important thinker living today. Dismissed by most people as relativist, which is quite easy to understand. So 3 times, those of you, to our viewers at home, download it and read it 3 times too, and then I won't seem so ridiculous to you. Any questions?
Actually, a question. Referring to said, in order for us as architects in South Africa to envision and imagine a better future, we would have to be modern and Latourian at the same time. And I'm wondering if we are now in a position to understand why all the mistakes or the limitations of the modern, is there any way that we can go back and follow that path and undo the mistakes or do things differently to arrive at a different position?
Well, I believe the answer to that is yes. I don't believe in bringing people out at 8 o'clock at night in order to shock and dishearten them, and then force them to be the instruments of their own disheartening by reading the stuff that further disheartens them. I am perhaps naively very positive from this perspective, and very positive from the perspective of this country, which I think can be the preeminent laboratory of all of these things in the entire world. I'm openly jingoistic or patriotic or whatever about this. Only because of all of you in this country. You have a particular generation that inherit the full force of contradiction, many contradictions, and you will either have to resolve these things or become grumpy old men and grumpy old ladies by the time you're 30 and then move to the Western Cape. So, you know, Latour's own view is that we do not jettison the modern experience and all its institutions. And we've seen tonight how very finely institutionalized it is. It's like a spaceship, an air-conditioned, habitable environment that is maintained at tremendous cost. The cost of colonialism is the cost of modern knowledge. It's one and the same. The cost of capitalism. Capitalism is only possible. To capitalize with money is fiddlesticks compared to capitalizing with facts and extracting surplus value from facts with formalization. With one formalization, you can leap across any point in the universe. You know, that's not, compared to that, a bit of arbitrage and moving your bucks around from, New York to Hong Kong and then back again, is nothing. So we have this institutionalization. It's not just a bad habit. It's not like saying don't bite your nails tomorrow. We have this institutionalization. But we need to understand that this institutionalization lived itself as something that it wasn't, and it maintained itself as if it were something that it wasn't. And what any philosophy student, perhaps, if they even read these things, would tell you about Latour is that from a philosophical point of view, he is an opponent of critique. So like Rorty, he believes that it makes no sense really to say that our problems come from not managing these little gardens properly, nature and, let's say, human. The knowing subject, the agent, the aesthetic subject, whatever, and here, nature as the sum of facts. Now, something is wrong with nature, we know that. You've grown up with the idea that something's wrong with nature. We certainly grew up with the idea that there's something's wrong with humans. They're not liberal enough, they're not tolerant enough, they're not free enough, they're not enlightened enough, etc. And then, we kept re-implementing programs here, which are the political equivalent of your recycling of plastic and glass in separate containers. So what I'm saying is that through critique, one got the impression that one simply had to manage these entities better, that one had to find out what was illusory in what we were doing and replace it with a more robust reality. White supremacism got certain things right. It created a republic, but there were many illusory factors in it, white supremacism being the most illusory of which, right? But we get rid of that and we manage this thing a lot better. We weed the garden and we plant the different perennials over there. And the same is true of nature. We need to know more about nature, and if we can just agree on the facts, we will go to COP19 or 17 or whatever it is. We'll have a political strategy, etc. But we know that hasn't happened. And for Latour, critique simply consists of managing these domains and their relations, which is where science happens, politics happens in these relations. Managing them by saying, we are making mistakes because we are subject to illusion. And if we can remedy this illusion, or reduce illusion, we will find and come down to the more real situation below it or behind it, or what is hidden from us. Then we act in accordance with that reality, then things get better and better. So there's a kind of perfectibility in critique. We spoke briefly last time about two very pervasive illusions, where in fact we think this thing behaves something like that, and we call that reification. And we think this thing behaves something like that one, we call that fetishism, animism, whatever. But those are little side plays in this general thing of managing this situation by critique. But Latour says this doesn't exist. In fact, a network exists and nothing else. And thinking of that is an effect of certain perspective in the network, and thinking of this is an effect of a certain perspective in the network. And the network cannot be managed by critique. It cannot be managed by critique. To separate out and purify and continue purifying and continue this kind of ritualization of purging and purifying and weeding out mistakes. Postmodernism is just critique, which says there's no underlying reality, but all we've learned to do is critique, so critique on, even if we don't find underlying reality. So compared to a Karl Popper who says we have the criticist frame, and through the criticist frame we get closer to the nature of reality, then you have someone like Baudrillard who says, well, whatever we have is just a spectacle, etc. So we may as well just critique the false. Even though we don't have a hope of finding the real, at least when we critique the false, we know it's false, even that there's nothing less false or whatever. These are just like grimaces. When a frog's leg kicks, even though it's dead, these are like the death throes. Postmodernism is like critique divorced from the promise of critique, which is that you're going to find something good in this thing. I mean, it's like the old joke about the very optimistic child who, had asked their father for a pony for Christmas. And when they arrived on the farm, they just saw this huge pile of manure, and they immediately jumped in and started digging, and they said, there's got to be a pony in here somewhere. And so that's the kind of postmodern predicament, because he's saying, even if there's no reality, we may as well dig. Now, so Latour is not a postmodernist, but he's basically saying that the modern conceived itself in these terms, and it conceived of critique, and let's not minimize it. Anything which involves Immanuel Kant, Hegel, Karl Marx, Nietzsche, Heidegger, etc., is not small and not easily dismissed. But it conceives of itself as something steerable or corrigible by critique. But in fact, it's a network which has to be managed in a myriad of ways. And this network has certain effects, and we have to place ourselves upstream or downstream of these effects. And he's saying that if we don't have critique, what do we do with this network? Because critique doesn't touch sides of the network. Critique touches sides with this ontology, which he says has never been. When he says we've never been modern, he says this has never happened. This might be a utopia of the modern, but it's never happened. We've always been in hybrids. We've endlessly been in hybrids, as we saw last time, which is this description of hybrids in all directions. We saw last time, this is this constant permeation of humans and non-humans. And they leave properties like a weaving shuttle. They go this way, that way, and then they leave certain properties for one another, but their properties aren't carried with them. They are like the loom. What comes out of it is an absolute hybrid of the warp and the weft. So if that's the case, this is a type of management? No. This is a type of description of a fictional utopia? Yes. Kierkegaard, who was a great opponent of Hegel, and a great enemy of systems, said that if Hegel had written his philosophy and said at the end, and this is just a thought experiment, he said he would have been the greatest mind ever. But because he didn't write that, he said he's the greatest buffoon. Okay, so it's a question of the status that one gives to this. And I'm not saying one should ever dismiss the modern, certainly not in favor of the kinds of options we have today. But this thing which doesn't adhere to these defining distinctions and possible refinement agendas, needs what he calls recomposition. And he says, I like this word, compositional. Hence I included the compositional manifesto as the second piece of reading, precisely to answer your question. For those of you who are about to sort of bite the bullet after reading this one, you then read the compositional manifesto and say, well, this is a way one can act in the modern without being duped by the modern. We need to act in the modern. It would be crazy to throw it away. The blood of the world has washed and bathed this thing. But we need to act in it in a compositional way, in a way which acknowledges its hybridity, and in a way which manages and enhances that hybridity, because it says the modern has spread hybridity across the globe, across the universe, whereas it thought it was spreading the possibility of a radical purifications. So the compositional manifesto would answer the question much better than I would. So read them both, please. If you're not reading, you're going to be confused, more confused. Next week, I want to look at that defining modern institution for architects, the Bauhaus. And then in our last meeting, I want to set out an agenda for South Africa, which is a very megalomaniacal task that I'm not at all equipped to do, but I'll try it nevertheless. Any more questions? Everyone happy so far? Anyone desperately confused and unhappy? I'm glad. Good. Well, thank you very much indeed.